We will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining Political Research Associates for our last webinar of our summer webinar series. And I will just put a note up front to stay tuned for the announcement of our fall webinar series, which will be leading up to the 2020 elections. For those of you who are new to PRA, Political Research Associates is a national nonprofit on the precipice of its 40th year. PRA provides research, analysis, and strategy recommendations to understand and combat anti-democratic forces. By exposing patriarchal and racist movements, PRA defends a vision of feminist multiracial democracy. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge some important events happening in our country that we're all bringing with us to today's discussion. The police shooting of Jacob Black on Sunday in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the fatal Tuesday night shootings during the ensuing protests, the protesters in Kenosha and nationwide whose demands for justice and reckoning are keeping this incredible movement alive. And amidst all this, the farcical RNC this week flaunting justice, decency, and truth. On this note, we are very grateful that you're all joining us for this important discussion on two courses for the US and globally, multiracial democracy or authoritarianism. For this discussion, we are joined by Dania Rajendra, Director of Athena, a coalition dedicated to delivering democracy. Dania is a former chair of the board of Political Research Associates, and we're really glad that she's back here with us today. And she sits on the board of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And we have Tarso Luís Ramos, Executive Director of Political Research Associates. Tarso is going to start us off today. Tarso, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and you can pull up your presentation.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for taking time out of your August afternoon to join us for such an uplifting discussion as one about authoritarianism and the alternative of a multiracial feminist democracy, which hopefully is what we're all committed to building. And what I'm going to do today is set a bit of a framework for what do we mean by authoritarianism? Why do we use that as a framework? What are the main drivers of authoritarianism? How do we understand those? And some preliminary ideas about strategies for intervening. And I'm thrilled that Dania, my former boss in a sense, as chair of the board of Political Research Associates, will be here to join me because Dania brings a particular strength in a complementary area to PRA's work, and great to be in the movement with Dania and thinking this through, both understanding the moment and innovating interventions that build democratic power. And so I am going to use a slide deck to walk us through a fair amount of material, and really looking forward to hearing Dania's presentation also, and hearing from everybody during the Q&A and discussion period. Please make active use of the chat for ideas and questions, concerns, placeholder comments that we can return to later on in the webinar. With that, I'm going to get the tech working here. That almost seemed to work. Yeah, okay, great, good. Just a very quick note about Political Research Associates for those of you who may be a little bit newer to the organization. We play several different roles in movements. As Koki mentioned, we're a nearly 40-year-old organization that has been doing research and tracking, monitoring, and strategy development focused on anti-democratic movements in the United States. And so we're a knowledge center that has been doing work around these kinds of anti-democratic movements for a very long time. Most of the work that we do is available on our website. You can find it, you can see the reports and articles and other kinds of things that we've produced, the multimedia, webinars like this one. A lot of what you can't see on the webinar is all the ways that we are a strategy partner and catalyst working together with social justice change makers, organizing and advocacy groups, journalists, philanthropists in some case, and others to build democracy. And then we do a lot of communications work, and often that communications work amplifies the work of our organizing and advocacy partners in the field. So just a little bit about ways to understand PRA's contributions. I want to step back a minute from the situation in the United States, because I think it's very easy to fall into a focus on the fall election in particular in the US context more generally. So I want to step back and talk a little bit about what's happening globally. According to the Human Rights Foundation, today more than half of the population on the planet are governed by anti-democratic rulers. And even The Economist, hardly a bastion of progressive thought and analysis has downgraded the United States from a fall, which I don't think it ever truly was, to a flawed democracy. And this is indicative of much broader trends. In fact, we are now living through a global period of democratic decline and the rise of authoritarianism. You know, we see this in Hungary, in Turkey, Russia, my birth country of Brazil again, and so many other states, from Milan to Manila, Berlin to Brasilia, Warsaw to Washington. Authoritarian leaders, parties, and movements are on the rise. This is in fact the third great wave of autocratization or authoritarianism. The first wave leading to mid-century fascism, classic fascism of the Nazi and Italian types. The second, the post-war dictatorships that cropped up all over the globe, oftentimes supported by either the United States or the Soviet Union in the kind of bipolar Cold War period. And now, just in the last 5 to 10 years, we're experiencing a third massive wave of authoritarianism. And under the recent context of the pandemic, we see that autocratic power is accelerating. So power grabs, whether it's by Orban in Hungary declaring executive authority, ability to rule by decree, Duterte basically having executive control over press censorship, and Netanyahu avoiding being deposed and tried for corruption, and instead extending his power and announcing intent to annex illegally large parts of the Jordan Valley. Or Trump's unilateral declaration of states of emergency that have allowed for even more draconian policies on the southern border is an example. Under the cover of COVID, we've seen an escalation and acceleration of authoritarian power grabs. Ultimately, it remains to be seen whether autocratic leaders will benefit from this period. It's kind of hard, although there's these opportunities for power grabs, it's kind of hard to scapegoat and deport a virus, to sort of play bully the way you would in othering you know, undesirable populations. So that's a question to watch. So if in fact we want to avoid American exceptionalism and understand what's happening in the US and global context, we think authoritarianism is probably the most useful concept or framework, more so than fascism per se. And with Trumpism, we're definitely headed more towards authoritarian relations in the United States. And as we all know, the 2020 elections will be a particularly significant inflection point. While voter suppression abetted by a Supreme Court hand Trump a second term, if he's defeated by a slim margin at the polls, would he attempt to stay in power, claiming voter fraud? In any case, authoritarianism is a useful framework. So what do we mean by it? Authoritarianism is a form of government that involves a highly concentrated and centralized power maintained by political repression and exclusion of potential challengers, right? Some theorists of authoritarianism say it's an equilibrium that rests mainly on lies, fear, and economic prosperity, that's sort of the formula by which autocratic or authoritarian governments rule. Another way to think about this is if pluralism, which is the idea of many voices, different religious perspectives, and so forth, if democracy is potentially unlimited pluralism, and totalitarianism is the elimination of pluralism, really just only the perspective of the state and nothing else is tolerated, authoritarianism is someplace in between. It's limited pluralism that concentrates the power in the hands of a small group or leader. In the words of political theorist Juan Linz, a Spanish political philosopher whose work on authoritarianism is quite important, there remain groups contesting for power that are not dependent on the state, but at the same time, it's the rulers who ultimately define which groups they will allow to exist and under what conditions. This clearly is the kind of power concentrated in the executive that Trump has been driving towards and has not yet fully consolidated. Authoritarian ideology tends to be less about ideological purity and more around generic values, and there's a kind of deliberate vagueness as authoritarian leaders seek to speak to their various parts of their coalition. So while I think most of us would recognize that Trump is not exactly a wordsmith, On the other hand, some of the seeming incoherence results from saying different things at different times to different parts of your base and not really worrying about the coherence, the ideological consistency or coherence. That's not unique to Trump. In fact, it's somewhat of a characteristic of authoritarian figures and leaders. So how's that different from fascism? Fascism is a form of totalitarianism, already mentioned. It's a particular form of it that seeks a kind of rebirth in a cross-class alliance from the ground, from elites down to workers, to resisting an alien or a foreign, set of adversaries, and seeking sort of a violent rebirth of a predestined future. So that's kind of scenario that most people are familiar with, if only passingly or through Hollywood movies, with respect to Nazism. There are proto-fascist elements definitely in Trumpism, but I think it's safe to say that at least not yet are we looking at state-level fascism in the United States, which really does distinguish what's happening here from, for example, what's happening on the Indian subcontinent, where you do have a neo-fascist Hindutva movement through the BJP under President Modi's presidency. And so there are some parallels and some distinctions between what's happening in the US and what we see that's more fascistic in some other corners of the world. A quick note about how democracies fail. Often there's an image that really derives from mid-century, maybe misunderstandings of mid-century fascism, that democracies fail through these sudden seizures of power. Suddenly there are brown shirts in the streets and a movement seizing power, military coups. But increasingly common democracies, such as they are, liberal and neoliberal democracies, slowly erode from within, often through anti-democratic politicians and parties who are allowed in, who are actually elected to office, and then erode what remains of democratic systems and protections from inside. So I want to now move from these general ideas about authoritarianism to the current context globally in the United States. I would argue that while no country is the same, there are some common elements that are driving liberal democracies toward authoritarianism globally and here. So let's consider these. One is severe economic inequality, right? The transfer and concentration of wealth upwards into fewer and fewer hands, creating hardship and resentment and bending the politics to the will of corporate oligarchies. The second is the rise of religious nationalism and theocratic movements, with all their misogyny and homophobia, transphobia, religious intolerance, into culture and politics, whether it's a Hindu right in India, evangelical right in Brazil or the United States, or Christian Orthodox right in Russia. These movements provide a mass base for repressive governments and a mass base to turn out to the elections. Very significantly, the most consistent and loyal part of Trump's voting base, for instance. And then the third is the rise of racial and ethnic nationalist movements and parties that define the nation, the people, in racist and other exclusionary ways. Well, in the context of the United States, these main drivers of authoritarianism globally map pretty closely to what PRA has long tracked as the main three sectors of the right-wing in the United States: the corporate and secular right, religious and Christian right, and racist and xenophobic right. And I want to be clear that these are broad categories. There are many crossover movements and figures within them. We're not going to spend a lot of time, unless folks want to, in the Q&A on this diagram. But it's important to recognize that there's no one sector of the US right that is capturing power. That power tends to get negotiated on the right wing across these sectors. And movements and strategies that successfully juggle and balance and align these sectors are the ones that tend to be successful. And if this looks a little bit like Trump's governing coalition, that shouldn't be surprising. I just want to recognize that in addition to those three drivers, there are at least a couple of others. One is this notion of demographic threat, or we might just say demographic change, as the United States and other northern democracies face a situation where white people, as currently defined, will no longer be a numerical majority. And then also climate catastrophe, climate change that results in competition for resources, that pushes more people into global migrant streams, including a lot of folks from the global south into the global north, in ways that exacerbate the racial panic in the northern hemisphere. So I just want to say a couple of things about that. I wanted a different map. This one will do. This shows counties that are showing sort of net gains and losses of, white supermajorities in the United States. At the level of the generation of, this is what I was looking for, of my kids, for instance, who are both born after 2007, the United States is already a so-called minority majority population. And so this is the future of the United States and much of the rest of the global north in ways that is provoking particular kinds of backlash. And I want to just say a bit about this. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this than probably Christian nationalism. This is a particularly significant inflection point, and we all know that white nationalists, at least initially, really threw their hopes and support behind Trump's candidacy in 2016. And part of what's happened here is that while only 3% of the population in the United States is part of the organized far-right or white supremacist movement, the cultural and institutional foundations of white supremacy enable a well-resourced movement that leverages culture and institutions to their ends. And white nationalism has moved since the great victories of the African-American Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act in the mid-60s, from a system supportive movement. We're relying on government to enforce Jim Crow, for instance, to maintain racial segregation and other forms of racial hierarchy, to a system oppositional movement, one that insists that while structural racism may exist in the United States, that the United States is no longer racist enough. And so white nationalism is a social movement, is making new demands on white supremacy as a system that says economic domination is no longer enough, that the project of white supremacy now must become, among other things, to maintain a large and permanent supermajority of white people in the territorial United States. In other words, to create a white ethno-state in the United States, which requires, among other things, expulsion of non-white people from the United States, their incarceration. It requires looking at methods of reproductive control for undesirable populations and so forth. And so part of what we're getting with Trumpism is this shift in the priorities of white nationalism responding to demographic change in the US and elsewhere, in this mythology of white genocide that animates the movement and aligns it with or amplifies its anti-Semitism in blaming Jews as those responsible for engineering a multiracial and multicultural United States. Okay, I'm gonna move on. So to put it kind of bluntly, the stakes in this moment include these: what democracy has ever survived a transition in which the dominant racial or ethnic group, or religious group for that matter, became a numerical minority. This is a very difficult transition point in any even quasi-democratic state, and we don't have to look very much further than our own history in the United States, where at the end of the Civil War, through Reconstruction and the passage of the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution that provided citizenship, voting rights, and so forth to formerly enslaved Black people, we saw, in response to what emerged as multiracial democracy, although not with women's suffrage, across the United States and particularly in the South, we saw violent backlash, the emergence of organized racial terrorism, and the emergence of a one-party racial dictatorship in the South that survived for a century, and that was able to leverage its power to dictate what could happen in terms of national legislation. So to say that we are at a precipice point in the United States with respect to will we have a democracy is not an exaggeration, in part, but not only because of this uncertainty and anxiety and even panic surrounding demographic change in the United States. So this raises all kinds of what then must we do types of questions. How do we understand the authoritarian playbook as it's unfolding in the United States? And what is our counter playbook? How do we build multiracial feminist democracy in a volatile context like this? And how do we embrace that is really perhaps the only antidote or alternative to authoritarianism that's on offer. The idea that we can have democracy but not deal with fundamental racial inequalities, or that we can have democracy that isn't feminist, is illusory. And so we're at an inflection point where if we don't address these fundamental contradictions and crises in democracy, we're not likely to emerge with one. So I want to, there's too much there to actually answer, but I want to at least seed some of the Q&A later on by acknowledging that there are any number of power bases that are critical to authoritarian fortunes, to autocrats and aspiring authoritarian regimes, right? The questions of loyalty and your ability to gain loyalty and to manipulate to your ends, the military and police, paramilitaries, of which we're seeing a dramatic rise in the US right now, the judiciary, political parties and loyalty in legislatures, elections and ballot access, media, communications and narrative, and the position of ruling and business classes in elites, which is one of the things that Dania is going to be speaking to. So what is the state of contestation in the US across some of this terrain? Where are the opportunities to block further consolidation of power by right-wing anti-democratic forces? And what do recent events, right, from impeachment to SCOTUS rulings to federalization of police being deployed in places like Portland and perhaps in Kenosha, tell us about the opportunities to block and build multiracial democracy? So I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to explore many of these questions in the Q&A. I'm just gonna make a few points about this here and now with my remaining time. So some election scenarios that I know we're all thinking about. One is one in which the elections may be too close to call in terms of the results. The election, for a variety of reasons, could drag out for weeks or even months. Those of us who were around for the 2000 elections, the Bush-Gore ones, with all of its hanging chads and mobilizations and lawyers being flown down to Florida, recognize that this is a possibility, even in drawn from the recent history of the United States. In a scenario like that, would Trump leave power? Would he hold on? Would he claim electoral fraud, which he's already been claiming for any number of months? What happens if Biden wins? What's the level of backlash or violence in the streets with paramilitaries? Do we see paramilitaries showing up at polling places to the extent people are still going to physical polling places? What level of voter suppression on the part of, with the complicity of the courts becomes possible in a scenario like this? We are already seeing, as I mentioned, the paramilitarization of civic and protest space. PRA, in cooperation with the Institute for Research on Education and Human Rights, created a mapping project looking at the appearance of armed white or armed far rightists at sites of Black protest or other sites adjacent to that around the country just since the murder of George Floyd at the end of May over Memorial Day weekend. And you can see there's an interactive version of this map that you can sort and examine at PRA's website. This is all across the country. And we have a situation where, as Koki mentioned at the top of the webinar, where armed far rightists are showing up sometimes to defend or to stand with the police in a sort of a thin blue line kind of position. The shooter in Kenosha, for instance, associated himself with an informal militia that sought deputization by the sheriff's office in and around Kenosha, and was refused that, but aligned themselves with that part of law enforcement. We have other far rightists showing up at these sites not to defend police, and sometimes even to enter into armed conflict with police, as has happened with shootings in Oakland and other places, in an attempt to accelerate a kind of collapse of what they consider to be an irredeemably socialist world order, including political and economic order in the United States, notwithstanding their views on Trump. It's interesting to note that in the deployment of federal political police to Portland and the occupation of Portland that ensued, Trump had to rely on those sectors of the police force that have proven to be most loyal to his regime. And so a very large number of these police have been US Customs and Border Enforcement. And so this was at least in part a test around loyalty. What part of the military or police forces will stand with Trump, even against local police forces, or in this case, against the will of the local mayor, under whom the police are, at whose pleasure the police serve ostensibly, and against the governor of the state, who objected to and insisted on the removal of these troops. I think that's a kind of test that we may see in other places. There was the threat of deploying similar, doing similar deployments under Operation Legend to Chicago, a variety of other places. We haven't seen quite the same presence as we've seen in Portland, but that could soon change with threats that are, or promises, threats that are being made with respect to Kenosha. I think there are a couple of other things about the Portland example, though, I just want to lift up, and then I'm going to move towards closing. The choice of Portland for confrontations, I think, were very significant, given that it's the whitest large city in the United States that has had a sustained anarchist and racial justice protest culture, not only since the 25th of May, but long before that. The choice of Portland has accomplished several things for the Trump regime that I think are important to keep in mind. One is that in choosing Portland, they were able to decenter the Black leadership and the Black uprisings happening all over the country, right? So they were able to change the subject from a focus on Black-led racial justice uprisings and pick a different kind of enemy, one that the administration, the Justice Department have already listed as a nexus to terrorism, right? Antifa. In doing so, they lean into existing FBI and Joint Terrorism Task Force anti-anarchist infrastructure that has been built in the Northwest over the past couple of decades. So the decision to go to Portland at the same time that they are figuring out how to build out a nexus to Antifa as part of a strategy for federalizing local policing was not, in my view, an accident. The third, it was just a show for Trump's base. This is the showdown that he wants, and we heard more of it from the RNC, in the RNC over the past couple of nights. He wants a kind of fight with Antifa. He wants this, American carnage, right? A law and order moment that reminiscent of Nixon. And this also allows for a pivoting of a policing model, including these loyalty tests that ultimately we know is intended for deployment against Black and other people of color-led infrastructure in places of a concentrated population of, of racial minorities or racialized populations. And so I think it's important to look at how what's happened in Portland may be deployed differently in other population centers around the United States. I'm just going to pause there and welcome a transition to Dania's presentation around the way in which corporate power and the return of oligarchy is both an independent driver and a driver with synergy with some of these other forces around rising authoritarianism. And then I look forward to having a discussion about what does that mean in terms of building a multiracial feminist alternative. So I'll stop there with hearts open, fists up, kind of orientation from PRA, and look forward to more conversation in the Q&A.
Thanks, Tarso, and thanks, PRA, for having me. Athena is a coalition of 55 organizations of many different kinds across the country. Unlike our namesake, we did not emerge fully formed, so if you'd like to join the fight to deliver democracy, let's talk. I would love to hear from you. We are named for the ancient goddess, in part because Athena wielded both sword and shield to protect and advance one of the world's first democracies, a democracy much like our own that had a lot of problems. And given the week and the year that we're in, it can be, I think, particularly hard to see the relationship of capital and authoritarianism And given that we work on Amazon at Athena, and I'm going to focus on Amazon in particular because Trump so famously feuds with Jeff Bezos. So I thought I would begin by situating Jeff Bezos amidst a few other historical captains of industry. So Koki, would you mind bringing up these slides? I find that bright, cheery colors helps with the distressing subject matter. Next slide, please, Koki. So I thought first I'd bring you George Pullman, the railroad magnate who developed the company town of Pullman, where workers worked. And in addition to creating horrific working conditions, and this is a picture of the 1894 Pullman strike led by Eugene Debs, they recreated plantation-like conditions for African-American workers, which, thanks to the courageous organizing of those workers, led to the first Black union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Next slide, please. This is Walt Disney, famously a big backer of the Red Scare and creator of deeply and incredibly reactionary and racist culture. I am sorry if you or small people in your life are big fans of Elsa. This is the historical figure of Walt Disney. Next slide, please. Henry Ford, who probably needs no introduction. This is a picture of 1932 hunger marchers, workers, and community members who were connected to people who worked at the Ford facilities who were starving in the Great Depression. I've also included Henry Ford's newspaper, the Ford International Weekly, the Dearborn Independent. Henry Ford somewhat famously helped really distribute the protocols of the Elders of Zion and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in the United States. Thanks, Koki. And less familiar to you, perhaps, is this guy, Torkild Reiber, and apologies to my Norwegian brothers and sisters and siblings if I have not said his name quite properly. He was the head of Texaco, and as such offered both money, cash money, and desperately needed oil to Franco, which allowed the Francos to prevail over at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, stronger Republicans, giving them enough time for Hitler to step in on Franco's side. So the nexus of big business, so this isn't just that these four guys are bad guys. I don't know Jeff Bezos personally, he might be really nice, but this is as much about the logic of the systems that produce and that these men are responsible for running as it is about them as individuals. But Jeff Bezos did have a banner day today. He is now proudly the owner of his 200th billionth dollar. And this kind of consolidated capital and massive inequality are not natural. They are the result of political choices that we have made as a society, and we can make different ones. It's incredibly racist. Not just about Amazon, but about how the economy works. Racism is baked into everything about how the economy works and shapes every economic incentive. So this is Mr. Bezos. As you may know, many far-right clusters and some organizations depend on the revenue they get from selling their goods on Amazon.com. But in keeping with the previous slides, these are also courageous Amazon strikers. The bigger picture are essential workers who took action with Athena efforts in the beginnings of the COVID crisis. And below them, slightly smaller, are the white collar workers who walked out as part of the climate strike last year. So it's not, of course, it's hard to choose just 4 historical examples of bad bosses with bad politics. I didn't even talk about people who own plantations and all of the other examples we might pull from. But I do think that thinking about the railroads as the infrastructure of commerce, Disney and the cultural production and the value of that in shaping ideology, Henry Ford and the way that cars depended on the government building roads and bridges, and of course oil, given the climate catastrophes, are helpful kind of convergence of what Bezos represents in our society. So next slide, please. This is Hibak. She's facing firing for speaking up about the conditions inside the Amazon warehouse where she works in Shakopee, Minnesota. And so I just really don't like to show a picture of Jeff without showing a picture of us immediately afterwards. Next slide, please, Cookie. So you probably know Amazon because you have bought something online. You are not alone. More than half of all product searches in the United States start on Amazon.com. Ours is not a guilt-based movement, and as I'll talk about, Amazon's a monopoly, so don't feel bad. But there's way more to Amazon than online shopping. Next slide, please. I borrowed this image, and you can see, I hope, there are the things that Bezos sort of works on, things that you might have used, like Workday. He's invested in, like Twitter. There are things he owns outright, like the Washington Post and his space exploration company, Blue Origin. And then there's the cluster of Amazon companies, of which this is nearly a sample. Things you might be less familiar with are like Twitch, which is the world's largest gaming streaming service. Whole Foods, I imagine you might be more familiar with. We can talk in the conversation if you'd like about their strategy of mergers and acquisitions. Next slide, please. I am sorry to say that it is not possible to boycott Amazon unless you give up the internet. The primary revenue driver for Amazon is their Amazon Web Services, which, like George Pullman, right, is the rails and the roads of the internet and of e-commerce. Zoom, this platform, runs on Amazon Web Services, as does Slack. And if you're feeling pretty exhausted and it's time to kick back, Netflix also runs on Amazon Web Services. Amazon is both a data company and has this enormous physical footprint that we'll talk about in a second. And so those two things together are kind of a new spin on the kind of control that companies like Henry Ford's and George Pullman's and Walt Disney's had in previous times. Next slide, please. So here in the United States, Amazon employs 850,000 people directly and also has helped to create 800 companies and employ 75,000 people who deliver packages. We can talk later in the Q&A, if you'd like, about how this relates to the current crisis the post office faces. Obviously, we're in deep solidarity with our siblings at the postal unions. There are also 140,000 independent businesses who sell on Amazon.com, and they have received roughly $3 billion in public dollar subsidies. This map of Amazon facilities, there are about 500 across the United States, comes from Athena member Good Jobs First. So I don't know how many of you remember the Richard Scarry town, but I really like thinking this is busy, busy town. And, you know, I like it because it gives us a window into all of the ways that Amazon shows up in our lives. So in the house where the bunnies are making dinner, probably groceries that they got from Whole Foods, they have an Alexa, which is recording all kinds of data. They may or may not have a Ring video doorbell on that pretty red door. Let's see. I made up a whole story for you. Where did it go? The letter carrier is actually not a letter carrier. He or she is an Amazon delivery service provider. Unfortunately, in this town, firefighters don't exist because Amazon has not paid any taxes. The police officer is operating a drone. We'll talk about that some more in a minute. The farmers no longer have a local economy, so they have no choice but to order everything that they need that they don't produce locally from Amazon. The milk truck is driven by a third-party seller who lost his business when Amazon changed the rules unilaterally. And the guy in the suit is the mayor. And he may or may not be Carteret, New Jersey Mayor Dan Reisman, who enthusiastically welcomed Amazon, which has a number of facilities in his town, and was a proponent of the tax subsidies that lured them there. But when COVID hit, he found he had no recourse to shut down the facilities when research showed that it was a place that was spreading COVID in his busy town, or rather our busy town. The kid behind him with the balloon has asthma from the emissions associated with Amazon facilities and deliveries in the neighborhood. You can't tell from her yellow t-shirt that she is a sunrise activist because Amazon offers bespoke contracts for even more efficient fossil fuel extraction, which, yes, includes fracking. I didn't come up with a reason that the cow is oppressed by Amazon, but I'm sure that there is one. Next slide, please. So they have lots and lots of money. They deploy it, and they also have lots and lots of data. They deploy it in all kinds of ways that are directly affecting our governance. So because they're the second largest employer, they use their size as an employer because so many communities are starved for quality employment. And Amazon does pay above the minimum wage to pressure governments into subsidizing their growth. As I mentioned, they are the biggest player in cloud computing and data storage and processing, which is what Amazon Web Services is. They have billions of dollars in government contracts. So even if you weren't gonna use Amazon to buy things and you weren't gonna use the platforms that rely on AWS, it's entirely possible that your local government's email or website is powered by Amazon Web Services. The way this functions is in the old-fashioned kind of company town. So if you think about the George Pullman example, right, he somewhat famously built Pullman, the town. He built the housing there, which was not particularly awesome quality, and he charged pretty high rents for workers to live there. And then when he cut wages, he did not cut the rent costs, which is part of what led to that big strike. So at Athena, we see all of the ways in which Amazon is harming us. We work on anti-monopoly efforts. We work for environmental and climate justice. We work to improve working conditions inside the facilities and throughout their operations. We work around these municipal governance issues. Amazon products like Ring are closely connected to gentrification. The police departments, there are more than 1,000 police departments across the country that have these relationships with Ring, the video doorbell, so that they can have access to the footage without a warrant often, which is an end run around both our civil rights and our civil liberties. Amazon is beginning to roll out facial recognition technology on that video, and we know that technology is already terrible at distinguishing amongst faces of color. So we work on these 5 things. And lastly, we work on surveillance and the role of facial recognition and other kinds of surveillance technology, as well as Amazon's close relationships with the immigration authorities. Because despite the somewhat high-profile feud between Jeff Bezos and Donald Trump, the things that make Trumpian policies possible to carry out rely on these technology companies and other big companies that aren't tech companies, regardless of the political affiliations of their leaders. So it's not just Amazon, it's Salesforce, it's Google, it's Microsoft, it's Wayfair, it's Ogilvy, so we say they have all that, they have lots and lots of money, they have data, but we have us. So to the next slide, please. Okay. Here is us. It's a bit of a roundup of the ways in which we're taking on Amazon's harms in our community and challenging the way in which they're governing our community, our communities. And I hope that you can see we are winning. So in at least a couple of places. In Arlington, where this Coalition for Us, Not Amazon formed in response to Amazon locating its HQ2 there, just outside, in close proximity to the Pentagon, despite, like in New York, where I live, of course, we famously stopped the subsidy for Amazon's HQ2. Amazon, of course, is continuing to grow here. And in Arlington, they weren't as successful on that front. However, they continue to fight, and then it allows them to win. So, for example, they've halted a partnership between the Arlington police and Ring that would give them the data in the way I was talking about. So we take on all these fights because there are pressing needs for working class communities, especially Brown, Black, and immigrant communities who are under so many vectors of threat in this time. But we take them on because we believe that contesting for governance, addressing the private consolidated power of companies like Amazon in our economy and in our society will help us break through the paradigm of authoritarianism that we see mirrored in the private sector and now in the public sector. That there's an interplay between the consolidated power that employers are and bosses are able to deploy against the people who work in their facilities, that that enormous amount of capital, Amazon's worth $1 trillion, allows them to bully local public officials and even state and federal officials, and that unless we address that and address the mammoth gaps between how much someone like Jeff Bezos has and how much suffering there is across the country about people who don't among people who don't have enough to eat and aren't sure if they'll be evicted at the end of the month and are choosing between their job and COVID exposure, that those contests are also about breaking through into a feminist multiracial democracy that finally represents us all and delivers what that democracy needs excuse me, to function, is the ability to deliver on the human needs that we see around us. And so that's why we say, next slide, please, okay, that Athena is about delivering democracy. We welcome you to follow us. And I'm looking forward to getting into how exactly the combination of data surveillance and data capitalism and the consolidation of capital into these mammoth individual fortunes and these enormous market capitalizations both drive the austerity that helps fuel far-right organizing and undermines confidence that government can deliver what people need in any meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dania. Thank you, Tarso. It's wonderful hearing from you both. We are going to open up for audience Q&A. And Dania, I'm actually going to continue on your last slide. Just a question from Marjorie asking whether you have a relationship, whether Athena has a relationship with Protect Democracy that has a legal strategy or a relationship with Biden's transition team.
We don't, and we're happy to talk to almost anyone. So I would welcome those conversations. We are part of a broad, small d democratic effort to encourage the Biden transition team to look for personnel that reflect the lived experience of most people in the United States and don't have the kind of significant conflicts of interest that too often plague public officials and administration appointees, especially in this one.
Thank you. Marjorie actually clarified, Tarso, that the question is for you as well.
I'm not aware of any relationship that we have with the legal organization Protected Democracy that was mentioned, so would likewise invite information about that. And PRA does not directly have a relationship with the transition team, although any number of our partners are engaged on different pieces, ranging from infrastructure to some other pieces. And again, if there's a productive role that someone might suggest we play, we would welcome that conversation.
The next question I'm going to ask is from Mab, and she asks, to what extent are Apple and Amazon in competition for control of our digitalized lives in this post-industrial economy?
Thanks, Mab, and also sorry for the background noise. I unfortunately do not control it. There are sort of four big tech corporations: Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google, and Microsoft is the fifth. Apple is the smallest and has the smallest market footprint. And so all of those companies are somewhat in competition, are certainly in competition. All of them have an outsized role, as I'm saying, and there are other really fabulous coalitions that take on the power, in particular of Facebook and Google, and we're glad to be in solidarity with those folks, some of whom are also members of ours. We think that Amazon, of those tech companies, only Amazon has this huge employment footprint. Only Amazon employs 850,000 people directly and then another 100,000 more indirectly. And so we think that that gives them an additional avenue around control over our lives and our governance that we think needs addressing.
Tarso, I'm going to ask a question also from Mab that relates to your presentation. Mab asks, what is the thinking about splits in army and police should Trump refuse to leave office? For example, the generals who have come out as critical of Trump versus those that participated in the march across the square from the White House to the church.
Right, I really appreciate this question. And it's such an important question, in part because the crises in democracy that have been brewing and are looming now go to questions of agency that are often beyond the purview of progressive movements, right, to influence, or at least have been historically. And so I think these are really important questions. It does appear, and I agree with what I understand to be implicit in Mab, your question, that there are splits in the military. My impression from what I've been able to ascertain in talking to folks who study this more than PRA does directly is that most of the military does not side with Trump. Maybe not quite to the extent that the intelligence community is sort of just up in arms about Trump. Nonetheless, the kinds of foreign provocations that Trump has threatened with China and with others, with Iran and others, generally speaking, are not welcome in the career military. And unlike with the court packing that Trump has managed to do with the judiciary, there hasn't been quite so wholesale a shift or change in personnel in the military in order to bring folks in who are fully aligned with Trump. That's really good news for us. And so I do think that there is some strong indication that an attempt, for instance, to avoid an election, which I don't think is plausible, but which Trump has floated as a trial balloon, or to avoid leaving the White House, regardless of what electoral outcome might be, is not likely to receive strong support from the military, which is of course critical, notwithstanding the possibility of pockets of support. Now we have seen a show of force already in DC, right? And Mab mentioned that in terms of clearing the square using National Guard and other forces for very opportunistic reasons. And so that sort of thing could happen. And I do think that this relates to the experiment in Portland and some other places, sort of testing who will stand with the regime, right, which is what I would call it, and who might stand them down. I think it's interesting that Governor Kay Brown did not call out National Guard and did not test that as a challenge to the federalized sort of political police that Trump sent there. And I do think this is a moment where many of us who have relationships beyond the sort of progressive circles that many of us inhabit really do need to be strategizing about where we might exert influence within some of these circles. You know, who can make a call to, you know, National Guard, you know, generals, colonels, and so forth, who can make those kinds of calls. It may come to decision points for individuals who are not aligned necessarily with a vision of democracy that's deeply multiracial and deeply feminist, to stand up against the precipice that Trump and others might take us across. I do think that the kind of thin blue line things that we've seen in the sort of cavorting that we saw between sheriffs, deputies, and armed personnel carriers in Rittenhouse, the man who apparently shot and killed 2 protesters, wounded another very gravely, is indicative of a level of problem that we have in local policing, where there have been many documented, caught on camera cases of cooperation, tacit alignment, or even full cooperation around targeting protesters for arrest between municipal police departments, including in Portland, and members of militias like the 3%ers or the Oath Keepers and others. I expect this phenomenon is likely to grow and accelerate as the call to divest and reinvest resources creates a sense of emboldened response from, you know, that we might call blue rage, right, within municipal police forces, bristling at the challenge, right, to the kind of Pinkerton power that came out of the company town experience that Dania was talking about, and the other legacy, of course, of municipal police departments being slave patrols, one way or other, charged with defending property, right, of one kind or other, rather than community safety. So I do think we're likely to see that. We may also see a proliferation of privatized police forces, which have their own danger of overlap with paramilitaries. So a last comment I'll make here is I do think among the things we should be thinking about in terms of local interventions and demands are how to assert like a low bar expectation of non-cooperation and non-involvement of vigilante paramilitaries within police departments, whether they're sheriff's departments or municipal, you know, city police departments on the one hand, or cooperation or collusion between those entities, because it's a growing phenomenon. The fact that curfew was not being enforced against young white men brandishing long guns at the same time that the Kenosha Police Department was focusing on enforcing the curfew for racial justice protesters tells you a lot about the dynamics that we're moving into.
Thank you, Tarso. Dania, did you want to respond? I think you just came off mute.
Well, I was going to say that I think in picking up the piece that Tarso was just saying about blue rage, and this might address some of your question, Ben, about the symbolic PR statement. So I think that part of why it really matters to bring this sort of framework of political economy to these questions is that in New York, for example, where it's you know, our governor's a Democrat and our mayor's a Democrat and most of the city council is Democratic, and even they, with the backing of so many people in the streets for so many weeks, were unable to stand up to the blue rage and to make meaningful cuts in the police department is deeply connected to the power that real estate and the real estate industry wields in our city, and the need for gentrification and the spiraling upward of property values to undergird the parts of the city's economy that functions. And so that may feel a little far afield from Amazon, but in the HQ2 fight, a big part of the strength of our side was in talking about the lived experience of that kind of displacement. People in Queens have been to Brooklyn, and we know what it's like when capital is just unfettered. And Andrew Cuomo's enthusiasm, right? He famously said he would rename himself Amazon Cuomo when they announced the deal, was as much like, sure, there's some glitz and glamour associated with, you know, Amazon and Apple and all these big companies, but also that it was going to help open up a new frontier into that kind of like extractive economy of gentrification, in which the police departments are also deeply implicated and are somewhat formed to protect. So I just kind of wanted to connect those things. And so so I think there's the blue rage, and then there's the incredible frustration of so many of us who feel so unrepresented when too few of our public officials can stand with people in the face of the pressures of the profit motive, and that is incredibly dangerous for a democracy. I think there's another question before Ben, so I'll turn it back over to you, Koki.
Yes. Did you want to address the second part of Ben's question about the relationship between monopolies like Amazon and the Christian right or the global religious right more broadly?
Sure. So as I said, you know, Amazon's a platform, right, upon which many people sell stuff. And it's both a cultural producer and a cultural disseminator. So I have an anecdote, right? An anecdote is not data, but that I'll share, which is related to the functioning of the algorithms, which is not limited to Amazon. But really there's kind of a direction which all these algorithms really reward a particular kind of content. So that includes like anti-vax and health misinformation, which played a huge role in the Brazilian election, for example, and is driving the anti-mask, I don't know what to call it, Tarso, anti-mask effort.
Phenomenon, let's say.
Phenomenon, right? And some pretty wild conspiracy theories and health misinformation, as well as like fundamentalist cultural products of various kinds, including Christian nationalist ones. So here's my anecdote to pivot. I read a ton of mystery novels, like all kinds of mystery novels. And I'm Jewish, I read about Jewish stuff. And my reading habits, mystery novels and Jewish stuff, has convinced the algorithm that I am a fundamentalist Christian, and that what I want to read are fundamentalist Christian novels where the detective is a small farmer in rural Virginia, and and the bad guy is a thinly veiled George Soros. And so Amazon is continually trying to sell me this series. It's like 13 or something books, and like it is because it has cross-referenced these two pieces of information, because in fact most books about Jews and Judaism are written by and for Christians, because there are just way more Christians than there are Jews, and so among other reasons. And so like that is one small and relatively inconsequential example of kind of the functioning of the algorithms that like on Twitter and Facebook reward conflict, and also there's so much conflict around misinformation, and in the case of, I just, that Times piece about the Brazilian election and WhatsApp and YouTube and the health misinformation, if you haven't seen it, is really pretty chilling.
We have time for one more question, and then I'll leave you both an opportunity to respond in general. But I want to ask a question related to the outcome of the election if Biden is elected. With Trump in the public consciousness, there's the discussion about authoritarianism in the US has been really related to Trump's administration, but there's a whole history of American authoritarianism, bipartisan history leading up into this political moment. So I would love to hear you, Tarso, speak to the implications of a Biden presidency beyond the point of turnover for this question of rising authoritarianism in the US, and Dania, to what a Biden presidency looks like in terms of addressing monopoly capitalism.
So a couple of thoughts about the possibility of a Biden presidency. I do think, you know, if we look at the recent history of how the right in the United States responds under Democratic administrations, it tends to be when the most militant and even revolutionary elements of the right come to the fore. You know, in the 1990s, under Bill Clinton, we get the militia movement, among other things. We get the Oklahoma City bombing. We get the sense that when shut out of the formal avenues or corridors of power, that all that's left, right, is sort of a violent contestation, and those who are advocating for those kinds of strategies get a larger audience and usually take bolder action. We saw a version of this also under the Obama administration, of course, with the rise of birtherism and in the planting the seeds for many of the militias that are now active. So groups like the 3% militia, the Oath Keepers, and so forth, those who were seated under Obama and then they really found their wings, I guess. The wind at the back as the Trump candidacy kicked in, which also fed the rise of the so-called alt-right and the new sort of version of white nationalism. So I think part of what we will see is ongoing destabilization by some of the most militant, I won't say radical, but the most militant elements of the US right. At the same time, there are kind of a couple of ways of thinking about, at least, right, the global crisis of liberal democracy, including in the United States. One way of thinking is the only thing that can pull us back from this brink is a kind of center-right coalition. And that's, I believe, what Biden, Harris represent. And if you believe that, then this election is maybe not such a terrible thing, right? If it can pull us back from that brink and open up enough space for building truly democratic alternatives. Another way of thinking, and these are not necessarily contradictory, is that a center-right coalition can't possibly reconcile the underlying contradictions of extreme wealth inequality, of neoliberalism that is driving militarization. You need a more militarized society in order to protect that level of inequality. It's creating the conditions in which companies like Amazon and others build surveillance and authoritarianism into their business models, right? It becomes profit centers, and they hope to get the golden meal to get government contracts to do those things. It doesn't matter ideologically where the individual CEO might be on human rights. If that's the profit model for the corporation, then we have a GM and Third Reich kind of relationship. So if a center-right coalition cannot reconcile those problems, structurally address climate change, structurally address, a fundamental anti-democratic, DNA of this country with respect to structural racism and so forth, then it won't be able to hold. And so I think the question then becomes, is there enough time to build long game power shift alternatives that actually do address these crises? In other words, if we get the reprieve, and it will be a bloody, in my view, and tumultuous reprieve of a Biden-Harris presidency, can we keep our eye on the long game enough to build power before the failure of a center-right coalition to make good on those fundamental questions result in another surge in right-wing power? And I think the danger of a sort of Macron-type government, in the United States, which tries to go back to status quo ante, which is basically slowing down the rate of austerity, but not fundamentally changing it, with a little sprinkling of human rights up on top, it's not going to hold. That's not going to avert these crises, and social justice movements won't stand for it at this point. And so it may pull us back from the brink, but something else will have to give. It's our job to make sure that that give is in our direction.
I believe it's Tarso who last presidential electoral cycle was talking about how we are not electing champions per se, we're choosing the terrain of contest. And so I would say that one of the things about working on a company, especially in the tech space, is that the company itself is a terrain of contest, and we are in a terrain of contest, as perhaps you have heard Scott Nakagawa say, right? There's our side, the side of multiracial feminist democracy. There is the corner that represents capital interests, and then there is the constellation of arguably like right-wing populists in various garbs. Although some scholars like Quinn Slobodian and, Nancy McLean would maybe argue that the right-wing populists are one side of the same coin as the corporate interests. So it's complicated. I don't know. Do the reading. See what you think. I will look forward to watching you on a webinar opine about that. But and so that's my Athena does both C3 and C4 work, but I'm going to answer your question, Koki, as an individual, which is like, of course, I hope that we have a new administration and a much better terrain of contest for all of the things that matter so much to us. And with my Athena hat back on, I would say that we really understand ourselves as one lane in a multi-lane fight, except whatever the green version of that is, one lane in a multi-lane bike lane or something, right? Like, unless we can, I think that that's a challenge for the Biden-Harris campaign and for everyone contesting for elected office now. Watching parts of the RNC this week, it's clear that they have a vision for this country, and that vision is compelling, and it is compelling to way more people than perhaps we thought it would be in 2015 and 2016. The current of feeling in the horrific spectacle on television this week is connected to a reality. People are scared and they are angry, and they are scared and angry. I am scared and angry for real reasons, and the ability to misdirect that, to instead direct it at, religious, racial, ethnic, or sexual minorities is incredibly dangerous, as we see, right? But unless people in public service and in public life can and are articulating something better than what we've had, it's hard to imagine how that can carry the day. That we need to find a balance of the righteous rage in the ongoing crises that we see on our side and hope that we can build something better. And so I think we see that in the kind of incredible interracial solidarity that follow these horrific murders. We certainly felt that way at Athena in the first flush of COVID, when we had tens of thousands of people supporting the courage of demonstrating frontline workers. And so that says to me that in just as there's all this misdirected and horrific posturing about what to do with that rage and sorrow and fear, there is a lot of inspiring and hopeful connection about what we might do with that energy to build a society that meets our needs.
Thank you. Do either of you have closing points you'd like to end with?
Go ahead, Dania.
I'm incredibly grateful to be here with all of you today and for all of what you do in this intense world to both meet the needs of the people around you and to build the solidarity we're going to need to look after one another and make a new set of conditions that doesn't give rise to this kind of phenomenon. So, thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Dania. I think it's so important to have the piece of analysis you hold around the ways in which rising oligarchy is a driver towards authoritarianism, from the workplace to communities. to the White House for that matter. And I'm looking forward to the fall webinar series where we can talk more about specific interventions that hold promise in this moment. I guess what I want to say as a closing remark for today is that while I think the political moment is incredibly fraught right now in the United States, I actually think we're living in a culturally incredibly generative and exciting moment. And it's not insignificant in the ultimate political implications, I think, are deep. One of the places where we've been losing very badly to the right and for decades is a fight over who's the we, who deserves to be here, who is we the people in the United States, who's expendable, who's democracy for. There are lots of folks on the right who believe in some version of democracy, just not for all of us, right? And so I do think that the betrayal, the intimacy of the betrayals related to the pandemic, related to now the crisis of public schooling, related to the economy, the intimacy of that has brought this question of shared fate and interconnection across racial and gender and class lines and immigration status to a place of real knowledge and intimacy that's not abstract. It's not like a rhetoric around shared fate. It's like, oh, I can't get my medicine. Oh, the people I rely on for healthcare, have this incredible threat. Oh, if they keep messing with the post office, my medicines might not come in the mail. That intimacy, I think we see manifested in some of the protests in the street now. We are actually seeing a kind of performance, and I don't mean in a cynical way, a kind of demonstration of a different understanding of who we the people are and must be in this country in order to build multiracial feminist democracy. And that is really significant. That fight for who is the we, I think, is the cultural shift that makes possible many policy and political shifts. And that's something to recognize, to build on, to name, to cultivate, to adjust our organizing and advocacy work in ways that embrace and incorporate that. And so I do think it's a generative moment. Part of our job as organizers who seek a different political future is to recognize and to extend the significance and length of this cultural moment of transition. We need that to be true, so let's make it true.
On that note, thank you both. This was really fabulous, fascinating to watch, and thank you all who attended. I hope you enjoyed it. We will be sharing the recording. Look out for it tomorrow in your inboxes. And again, as Tarso mentioned, our fall webinar series to continue these discussions.